Hey folks, Steve here with a special review video for you today. We're going to be looking at my review for Reluctant Enemies, a entry in the OCS System Operational Combat Series. If you've been watching the channel, that's been the playthrough campaign that I've been doing for the last, week plus an off month. And I'm at the point now where I think I can do at least a basic review here now. My usual review style is an intro, an in-depth look at mechanics and the way a game works, and then I'll do sort of the what I really think of the game towards the end of that video. Because this is OCS, and I feel like there are a number of other resources available for you to see how OCS works and other videos in that category of content. It doesn't make sense for me to do that in this video. So this is going to be a little bit different. We're really just going to talk here about what I thought and review the game without all of the mechanical explanation. You can watch the playthrough series. I did cover things in more depth in the early parts of that series, and then things became much more abbreviated over time. So take a look at that. There are other videos of this game available from Wardrobe Plays World War II, Callendale, where you can get some snippets of the way everything works together. This review is a little challenging because I'm really trying to talk about what I feel are three distinct perspectives of this. In some part, I'm reviewing the OCS system as a system. In some ways, I'm reviewing Reluctant Enemies just as a game, and then Reluctant Enemies as a beginner's OCS game. Now, I'm not totally new to OCS prior to this playthrough that I had done for this review. I have played Tunisia 2 at a convention, but a convention setting is very different from being able to play it slowly at home, solitaire, really make sure I know what I'm doing as I go through every step of the gameplay. So this was really for me an opportunity to get a good sense of the game itself and the mechanics altogether. Now, it is a series game, which means that while it uses the OCS base rules, it does have its own game series rules. Most of those aren't totally crazy that it really changes the system up too much. The scale is a little bit different from some OCS games, and there are some special rules, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I will say what was a huge help along the way was the OCS starter guide. If you were to get a box of Reluctant Enemies today, you would get a version of the starter guide that is fine, but on OCS Depot, you will find, if you just Google OCS Depot, you will find the website. You'll find an errated version that includes some fixes and stuff, and I do recommend taking a look at this version. I printed it out. It was really good to kind of play along for a little while until eventually the die rolls sent us off on a different path, but it was a huge help just to understand how do I make sense of the map, how do I make sense of the positions of units, where ultimately are things at, how do I even get started. So a huge help. So this is probably a big bonus if you're going to play an OCS game for the first time, that if it were Reluctant Enemies, this is really handy. Something to this level of detail for other games would certainly be useful. There are some similar things for the Vitebsk scenario, I think, in Smolensk, but I'm not 100% sure of that. You might have to double check me on that, guys. I did play through using the 4.3 version of the rules and charts, which I pulled from a more recent OCS game. Ultimately, I don't think that's a huge difference. I think what comes in the box is 4.1. The other thing I should point out as we're going here is that this game, I don't believe, is in stock from MMP currently. It's kind of sold through what's out there. So if you are playing this as a first-time OCS game, it's entirely possible that you have purchased this secondhand. If you're looking to get into OCS, there may be other more recent beginner options available to you, either direct from MMP, Multiman Publishing, or some other method, and they are reprinting as of this video in August 2023. They are going to reprint Sicily 2, which was a magazine game, and Luzon is coming, which will be a very different game. I'm looking forward to that. And Smolensk might still be in stock. I'd have to go look at that. Anyway, the point is, ultimately OCS is a big system, and there are multiple entryways into that system. Even if you were to buy a bigger game, each of the bigger games do include smaller scenarios that you could kind of learn the system on. So, right now, because of that, if Elected Enemies is going to be your first OCS game, it's probably a just fine entry. You may have other options, so something to keep in mind. In looking at the system of OCS, I will say that there are folks out there who are seasoned veterans of the system that will say that, OCS is not that difficult. It's really relatively simple, or like, it's really simpler than it seems. I will just say from my perspective, I don't think that's true. I think this game is complex. The rule book's not that bad, I guess. I mean, it's, in terms of actual rules content, it's a little over 40 pages, which not even all the time do you really even need to know the rules for everything. But I think what makes OCS difficult is, yes, there are lots of rules governing lots of different things. You do need to read them and evaluate them and really consider them to make sure you're actually executing it properly at the table. Like you're actually playing the rules as the way they're meant to be played. But beyond that, the threshold to play competently, not even good, but just competently at OCS is much higher than most other games. And the consequence of failure, or the consequence of not playing very well, tends to be very high, and there's a high likelihood for you to screw something up. So when you look at it that way, I can definitely see, like, this is kind of more of an intimidating system for somebody who maybe isn't as used to those kinds of systems, that may be used to easier systems or games. So it's high threshold to play well. If you don't play well, or if you don't have the seasoned experience, there's a high likelihood of failure, and then a high consequence for failure. And so beyond just here's how you play the game, putting it all together at the table, combining possibly the air war aspects and performing well at the air war, which feeds into performing well basically in every other part of the game, often managing your supply, but then also doing the usual movement and combat things that maybe most hex and counter war gamers are used to. So you have to pull all those things together, and it is a tall order. And so then I think the question becomes, and there are other games like that, certainly. I mean, World in Flames is a little bit like that, and I'm really into World in Flames. When those kinds of things are factors in a game, you really then have to ask, is it worth that level of effort? Is the gaming that you're getting out of it worth the time and effort spent into actually executing the game? I think generally speaking, in my time with OCS so far, I'd say it is. And even in Reluctant Enemies, and I put this in some of the comment chats on the playthrough videos, you definitely find yourself in situations that a lot of other war games tend not to portray, or either it's handled at a different abstraction layer where, you might have all the right guys in the right positions in the right area, maybe outnumbering your opponent, but you don't have the supply to do all the things that you want to do, and it's cost prohibitive to try to make attacks without the supply that you really think you need or want and have. And that's just something you don't get, and that's a factor. Everything you're doing. I'm not going to attack with this 6 units against 2 units attack, because I only have enough supply that I can really throw 2 units at it, and maybe I can make that work, and that's very cool. The way that terrain is used in the system is very, very interesting. You definitely feel terrain effects very significantly, and we found that in the Reluctant Enemies playthrough when, okay, hey, if we're out in if we can force the enemy to go back in a clear terrain, we're going to artillery strike them, we're going to air bomb them, we're going to hit them, and it's going to work very well. But if somebody's sitting in the mountainous terrain, it's going to be harder to disorganize them, and it's going to be harder to fight them unless you get fortunate and lucky. And so the right application of your resources at the right time and place is a huge factor. And that's all very good stuff. And even the combat results, where you can, if you want to spend the blood, and men, you can force your enemy to take an option or retreat. And so there's a little bit like, when you look at the decision space, from the beginning of your turn and really across multiple turns, you're building up supply, you're finding the point of attack, you're trying to figure out the best way to disorganize the defenders, you're making that assault, you're maybe then making some decisions on the combat results about whether you're willing to take a loss or what to make the opponent take an option loss or retreat or whatever, compounded by your moment of saying, am I going to take my reserves and exploit the breakthrough here, right? And there's multiple layers and stages to that, and yes, there will be turns where things are very slow and you're just accruing the supply to do the operation that you really want to do. That's a very different mindset than maybe a lot of faster playing war games. And I know that fast playing seems to be a tagline in a lot of advertisements for games. Like, hey, it's a quick playing, fast playing, blah, 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 game. This is definitely not that. Even a smaller game like Reluctant Enemies, we're really talking about many minutes to go through a player turn, if not longer than that for the bigger games, right? Like really sitting there and trying to figure out, okay, I'm going to try to make this happen. But generally, I'm coming away saying, hey, I do like OCS as a system, and so if we're going to look at it from that perspective, I think OCS is a very interesting system. It can provide game experiences that you're not going to get in other game systems. And while I certainly have friends who would look at OCS and go, no thanks, let's play BCS instead, different kind of supply concerns in that system. I do know enough people that, if I really want to play some OCS, I definitely can. If I don't want to play Solitaire, and even Solitaire still plays fine, you have to kind of restrict yourself a little bit and try not to be peeking at your stacks, perfectly calculating odds, because in an opposed game, the Fog of War rules are such that you can't examine enemy stacks. So in this game, that's not a huge deal because you're dealing usually, or a lot of the time, with exceptions certainly, a lot of the time you might be looking at the only unit in a hex, and so you know what's there, you can set up your attack the way you want. But once you start seeing stacks, you really don't know what's going to be there unless you've been really paying attention to your opponent's moves and seeing kind of what's where and where's he going with what. So yeah, it's a dense system. That's maybe the best way to describe it. It's a dense system. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to it to play well, but it does give you something of substance that is, unique in its nature and fulfilling, because it forces you to think about things that in many war games you're simply not worrying about the same way. We sort of talked to Reluctant Enemies as a beginner OCS game a little bit ago, just kind of round that off a little bit. I do think this is fine as a starter game. Again, the starter guide helps a lot. They even have an extended starter guide on the OCS Depot where, while this covers the first turn, basically, they've actually done an extended version of this that covers the rest of that campaign game. And it's good to even just read it. I found it really fascinating to read. After I had completed my campaign, I reread it, and I just thought through, like, okay, is what I was doing pretty close to what they were doing for the right reasons, for the same reasons? And I found that it did. And so that training of the starter guide, playing through a campaign that does generally have some clear, like, this is probably going to happen if you're playing somewhat competently, and I could track that progress. I could understand kind of where I'm at, and that was good. And so there is, if not a script, a rough idea of how this campaign is going to go, and you can read the very good historical notes and still get the same sense of, okay, and how's this going to work? How's this going to go? Where are we going to end up in terms of the significant areas of concern? And in Reluctant Enemies, that's the coast, that's the mountain valley, or the valley between the mountain ranges, and then the approaches to Damascus and everything else around Damascus. So within the first couple of turns, maybe you would have a hard time understanding how do you get to that point. That's where the analysis paralysis can come in. It sounds like you kind of get hit with that every time you play a new OCS game. You really need to look at the map, you need to understand what's going on, and if you're new, it could become so overwhelming that you don't know how to start. The starter guide certainly helps with that. It's a good way to proceed forward. And then, eventually, as those opening turns work out, you're probably going to end up in those 3 lanes, operating that way with the supply situation very clear. I think what's confusing in this game is at the beginning, there are supply depots in weird places, and so trying to think through, like, how do you get a rolling with your units where the supply is in some places is maybe not super intuitive right away. But once you started using your trucks or your carts, your rail cap to move supply points around the map to where you really want them, things kind of shift into, like, this is the efficient way to go. This is the efficient place to put the supply based on where my HQs are. And you kind of get into the rhythm. And once I got into the rhythm, the game started going very fast. And I was able to just go, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I can't do that yet. I'm going to wait. I'm going to get some supply. I'm going to do this, that. And it became very quick. I knew what I needed to do or what I was going to try to do, and then let the dice kind of tell me what's what. I will say, the whole surprise mechanic is one of these features of OCS that is, I don't know, it's just one of those weird systems that you're not used to seeing, where a 3-to-1 combat can suddenly become a 12-to-1 combat. What I did find is the surprise doesn't matter as much as in my head I think it does. And you can still work out, you can still kind of plan and say, well, hey, if I think this is going to be a 3-to-1 attack, and the action ratings of my units are pretty similar, or within maybe 1 of each other, there's still the majority chance on the bell curve, and this game uses 2d6 a lot, which means we're working with the bell curve, and I always appreciate a good bell curve, because it is a nice way to adjudicate things that should happen frequently, and allow for standard deviations. Most of the time, even with a +1, you're probably not going to get surprise on a regular attack, and maybe you have a bit of a better chance on an overrun. So you can still kind of calculate things out if you're attacking a single unit in a hex. The fog of war doesn't matter, and you work it out to be 3-to-1. Yeah, it's probably going to stay 3-to-1. You start getting those DGs, and now you start getting those action rating beneficial advantages. Then you use that as your floor. It's 3-to-1. That's maybe the floor, but if anything, I'm going to get either no surprise or attacker surprise, and it could just get a whole lot better. So I do think, like, the expected results factoring stuff you still can do to a point. The fog of war is a limiter on that. You do get the pencil in the eye when defender surprise happens, and it does happen. I think that, that's one of those things. I think in other games, like East Front games, the Soviets are going to just have to eat crap with their crappy action ratings and hope to get defender surprise or somehow manage to get attacker surprise on a counterattack some of the time. And in this system, there is this element of, yeah, it should go along these lines, but that surprise could shift things dramatically. And shift things dramatically, especially when you're working with overruns, with your top tier mechanized units, that sort of thing, is obviously how you get the big breakthroughs and the big game winning moves. And you learn that in this game, I think, just as well as you would learn it in others. And in fact, in terms of a beginner's experience, again, because there's the 3 lanes, what you're going to probably end up with is 3 front lines, and then if you're shepherding your units well, 2 to 3 reserve stacks across the board, 1 in each lane, and you're starting to learn that, okay, here's my boilerplate, here's where I'm at, and then here's how I'm either going to be able to offset my opponent's attack, or I achieve my breakthrough the way I need it. And being in a lane maybe reduces your options because there's only so many places to go on the coast or in the valley. But again, as a learning thing for the whole system, it gives you a nice constrained space to learn what works and doesn't work, or where betting on luck is your only thing that you can really do. So, as a game itself, just as a solid Reluctant Enemies, maybe in as much of a vacuum as we can afford it, I think Reluctant Enemies is a pretty good game. I had fun with it. It is really interesting to play a war game on a topic that almost nobody really knows much about. As a sanity check, I looked at some of my World War II books, and in Donald Keegan's book, there's like a page that represents Operation Export, or touches upon events in Syria and in this area of the world. So having a game just on this topic is very cool. It's relatively unique. I don't know how many other Operation Exporter games there are. And both sides have things that they're trying to achieve, and there is asymmetry involved. So generally, the Commonwealth has a lot more units, but until later in the game, the Vichy have a really strong armor advantage. They have really powerful armor units that can give them a really good counterattack capability. Their air, for a while, can be overwhelmingly more powerful than the Commonwealth. And even when the Commonwealth get reinforcements, there's no direct guarantee. And the Commonwealth is busy trying to make gains and have a much harder time shifting their supply around. So they have a lot of resources, a lot of capability, but they're trying to think of the right word. They have a lot of capabilities, but their opportunity or their constraints to capitalize it is tougher. They've got to move their supply up. They've got to travel a distance. While the Vichy, you're basically operating on the shoestring budget of, you're not going to get units back for the most part, besides the special reconstitution rule, which I'll talk to in a second. But you got to do this fighting retreat, and you're really picking your defensive lines to say, no, I can try to hold them here, and I've got my supply and I've got my reserves, and I'm going to try to hold them here. Maybe some of the time that could mean that the Vichy player isn't going to have as much fun because they're going to be stuck in this defensive thing. But I think if that Vichy player is making use of the armor well, which I did not, I could have played better as the Vichy in my playthrough for sure. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the Commonwealth will win all the campaigns. I think Vichy certainly can win. But you have to use your units well, and it's that armor is a huge factor. Making smart moves and finding that opportunity for breaking the Commonwealth line. It could happen. Then otherwise you're really playing for time in the victory points to determine victory. The one rule that I kind of questioned a little bit, but by the end of the game I felt pretty good about it, was the Reconstitution rule, where basically for every 3 units eliminated, you get 1 back. That unit is drawn randomly from your dead pile. I was trying to think through as I played the game, I'm like, can I, not that I would really want to, but can you break this? Can you game this a little bit? Is this a good solution to what the designers felt was a problem with battles being too bloody and not having enough units to make the tempo work to the historical narrative? I found the one issue would be like if you lost your armor early in the game, and as say like Vichy, and you didn't have that many other lost units, it would be easier to get those guys back because there's a smaller pool of units to draw from. You can get that armor back. if you lose your armor after you've lost a lot of other units, you're probably never getting that armor again, unless you're really lucky with your pulls. I don't know, like, it must be balanced to some degree, because, if you lose your armor early, it's like, gee, shucks, that sucks. But if you can get it back, or you have a decent chance of getting it back, then that's okay. And if you manage to keep your armor alive long enough that you lose it later in the game and the dead pile is really big, well, you got all those turns of use out of your armor. So that is kind of a self-balancing thing. And then ultimately, it did work well, where it was like, at times I thought, hey, I was going to break through Vici lines and I'm going to win the game. But nope, they managed, we killed enough Vici units that there's still a couple left, and here they come. They're reinforcing, plugging a hole in the line. So I think that special rule for this game was well applied, and it did help add some longevity to the campaign, where, yeah, there's not that many units in the whole game when you play the campaign, but that Reconstitution just keeps things from being maybe too easy of a, hey, I cracked you, hey, I exploited, game over. That helps it a lot. But it would be one of those weird things when I go to play another OCS game, that rule won't be there. I'll have to make, I'll have to adapt. Like, every game you play in OCS is a little bit different with the game series rules, just something to deal with. But generally, just as a game, I think there's a lot to offer. There's interesting ways to play the game, where, if you played Vici, then you play the Commonwealth, you kind of get a very different experience. You have different things you're trying to solve for. And, all the way through, there's interesting puzzles to try to be solving within the OCS system. So to kind of wrap all those three things together, the OCS perspective, the newbie perspective, and just the game perspective, I do think Reluctant Enemies is a pretty strong game. It's certainly fun as a solitaire experience. I'm sure it is fun opposed. If there's anything to watch out for, or to maybe be conscious of, is that there might not be as much replayability here, because you are going to probably end up in those 3 lanes. You're going to play through those things, like the constraints of the map, of the scenario, will be such that you'll be commonly doing the same types of things if you're playing it again. That doesn't mean that the game will just end up in the same place, because maybe one game to the next, Vici forces throw the Commonwealth off balance, and they've run a unit into Haifa and they win an automatic victory. That's all conceivable stuff. So it's definitely, maybe we're playing more than once, but just know that, there will be some common narrative things that will probably happen in each campaign, where things will look familiar. I get the sense of that, having played through. That's not that big of a knock against the game. So if you have not played Reluctant Enemies before, if you think you want to give it a try, I think it's probably worth the effort and the time to play it. The full campaign is 21 turns on a single map. It is not a huge OCS game by any means, and ultimately, OCS games that are huge, like Case Blue and Guderian's Blitzkrieg, are just one flavor of OCS. And as we're seeing, there are others, and when Luzon comes out, that will be another OCS experience in a very different box of constraints than many other games. So what is nice is OCS seems to still be able to support a lot of different types of game experiences and campaigns. So this one, if you like tough terrain intermixed with some open terrain, opportunities for exploitation, some armor fighting in the desert, and tough, struggling assaults through the mountains, then Reluctant Enemies just might be for you, and is worth a look. Again, you may have to look at the secondary market here in 2023, but there's certainly some copies out there to pick up. So very generally, a recommendation from me. I had a good time with it. I like it. It's going to stay on my shelf for sure. I hope this review was useful to you if you were on the fence for Reluctant Enemies or the OCS system in general. I think this is a just fine place to start, even with some alternative newbie options on the market horizon for us in the very near future. So With that said, thank you for watching, guys. I appreciate it. If you like this, hit like, do the whole YouTube thing. But otherwise, we'll see you in the next video series. Take care. Keep gaming.